The blood-red sunset of 1876 painted the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado, the same color as the handprint on Grace Collins's cheek where her brother had struck her not 10 minutes prior. She clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma tighter to her chest, the infant mercifully sleeping through her mother's distress as Grace's boots crunched over the packed dirt road, desperate to put distance between herself and the saloon where Randall waited. "You can't keep running from me, Gracie," the familiar voice slurred behind her, making her stomach twist with dread. "That baby's worth good money to the right folks. Childless rich folks back east pay top dollar." Grace quickened her pace, the thin shawl around her shoulders providing little protection against the early evening chill. She'd known her brother was a scoundrel, but selling her child, her own flesh and blood, had sunk lower than she'd ever imagined possible. "I said stop," Randall bellowed, his footsteps heavy and uneven behind her. 6 months of sobriety had vanished the moment her brother had appeared on her doorstep 2 days ago, pockets empty and schemes plenty. Now he was drunk again, dangerous again. She darted between 2 buildings, hoping to lose him in the warren of alleys that ran behind the main street. Emma stirred against her chest, making small fussing sounds that threatened to become full-blown cries. Grace hushed her gently, bouncing her as she walked. "It's just good business, Gracie," Randall called out, his voice closer now. "You can always have another one. Think of the money." Grace felt hot tears streaming down her face. Widowed just before Emma was born, when her husband Charles died in a mining accident, she'd been barely scraping by as a seamstress, but she'd rather starve than part with her daughter. She turned another corner and collided with something solid, a man's broad chest. Strong hands steadied her as she stumbled backward, and she looked up into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin, a day's worth of stubble on his jawline, and a cowboy hat tipped back on his head. "Whoa there, madam," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You all right?" "Please," Grace whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "My brother." "There you are." Randall appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face flushed with drink and rage. "Hand over that baby, Grace. I already told a fella I'd have her by morning." $500, Gracie? Think what we could do with that." The stranger's hands fell away from Grace's shoulders as he turned to face Randall, his posture shifting subtly. Grace noticed the well-worn holster at his hip, the confident way he positioned himself between her and her brother. "Sounds to me like the lady doesn't want to give you her child," the stranger said, his voice deceptively casual. "This ain't your business, mister," Randall snarled, swaying slightly on his feet. "That's my sister and my niece. Family matter." "Is that right?" The stranger's hand rested casually near his holster. "Madam, is this man bothering you?" "He's trying to sell my daughter," Grace said, her voice breaking, "to strangers back east. For money." The stranger's jaw tightened. "That so?" He stared hard at Randall. "Well, that child ain't going anywhere with you. Not while I'm breathing." Randall's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "Name's Jake Norwood. I'm passing through town, but I've got time to make sure this lady and her baby are safe." He took a step forward. "Now, I suggest you turn around and walk away before this gets unpleasant." Randall's hand moved toward the pocket of his worn coat, but Jake was faster. In one smooth motion, he drew his revolver and aimed it at Randall's chest. "I wouldn't," Jake said quietly. Randall froze, his face contorting with rage. "This ain't over," he spat, but he backed away, stumbling slightly. "You hear me, Gracie? This ain't over." He turned and disappeared around the corner. Jake holstered his gun and turned back to Grace. "Are you hurt, madam?" Grace shook her head, though her cheek still stung from Randall's earlier blow. "No. Thank you, Mr. Norwood. I don't know what would have happened if—" "Jake, please." He looked down at the bundle in her arms. "And who's this little one?" "Emma," Grace said, adjusting the blanket so Jake could see her daughter's face. Emma had awakened now, her big eyes blinking up at the stranger. "She's 6 months old." Jake's face softened as he looked at the baby. "She's beautiful." He glanced in the direction Randall had gone. "Your brother. Will he be back?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Randall doesn't give up easily, especially when he thinks money is involved." Jake nodded grimly. "You got somewhere safe to go?" Grace hesitated. "I have a small room above the seamstress shop where I work, but Randall knows where it is. He found me there yesterday." Jake seemed to consider something. "I've got a room at the hotel. You could stay there tonight and I'll take the chair." Grace stared at him, surprised by the offer. "Mr. Norwood, Jake, that's very kind, but I couldn't impose. And people would talk." A faint smile touched his lips. "Let them. Better a bit of gossip than you and the little one in danger." His expression grew serious again. "What's your name, madam?" "Grace Collins." "Well, Mrs. Collins, I promise you I'm a gentleman. I just want to make sure you and Emma are safe until we figure out what to do about your brother." Grace knew she should refuse. Taking help from a stranger, a man she'd just met, went against everything she'd been taught about propriety. But the thought of facing Randall again, alone, with only Emma's small life between him and the money he craved, she couldn't risk it. "Thank you," she said softly. "Just for tonight." Jake nodded. "Do you need to collect anything from your room?" "A few things. Diapers for Emma, a change of clothes." She glanced nervously in the direction her brother had gone. "I'll come with you," Jake said, understanding her fear. "Then we'll head to the hotel." As they walked toward the seamstress shop, Grace couldn't help wondering about this man who had stepped so readily to her defense. "What brings you to Cottonwood Springs, Mr. Jake?" He adjusted his hat. "Just passing through. I'm a cattle driver most times, but the season's over. Thought I might try my hand at something else for a while." "You're not meeting anyone here?" Jake shook his head. "No, madam. Just me and my horse." He glanced at her. "What about you? Have you lived here long?" "Almost 2 years." Grace shifted Emma to her other arm. "My husband and I came out from Pennsylvania. He found work in the silver mine, but there was an accident." She trailed off, the memory still painful. "I'm sorry," Jake said simply. They reached the small shop, dark now after closing hours. Grace led him around to the back staircase that accessed her rented room above. She fumbled with her key, acutely aware of how small and shabby her living quarters would appear to this stranger. The room was indeed small, a narrow bed against one wall, a small table with one chair, a chest for her clothes, and a cradle for Emma. A tiny stove provided heat, and a washstand stood in the corner. Everything was clean but worn, speaking of careful poverty. "It won't take me long," Grace said, feeling oddly embarrassed as she laid Emma on the bed and quickly gathered a few essentials into a small carpet bag. Jake stood by the door, his tall frame making the room seem even smaller. His eyes scanned the sparse furnishings, lingering on a faded daguerreotype on the wall, Grace with a smiling young man, presumably her husband. "He was a handsome fellow," Jake commented. Grace glanced at the picture. Charles was a good man. He would have been a wonderful father. She closed the carpet bag. Ready. Jake took the bag from her hand. I'll carry that. Grace picked up Emma, who was beginning to fuss. She'll need feeding soon. They made their way to the hotel without incident, though Grace couldn't help scanning every shadowy doorway for signs of her brother. The clerk at the hotel desk raised an eyebrow at the sight of Jake, accompanied by a woman with a baby, but Jake's steady gaze and a gold coin silenced any questions. Jake's room was simple but comfortable, with a large bed, a dresser, a washstand, and an upholstered chair by the window. He set Grace's bag down and immediately moved to the chair. You and Emma take the bed, he said. I'll be fine here. Are you sure? Grace asked, bouncing Emma gently as the baby began to cry in earnest. Positive. Jake turned his back, giving her privacy. I'll step out while you feed her. Maybe see about getting us some supper sent up. Grace felt a wave of gratitude. Thank you. When Jake returned half an hour later with a tray of food, Emma was fed and dozing in Grace's arms. Grace had managed to wash her face and smooth her hair, though she was still wearing her worn dress from the day. The dining room was closing, but the cook put this together, Jake said, setting down the tray of beef stew, bread, and coffee. They ate in a surprisingly comfortable silence, and Grace found herself studying her unexpected protector. Jake Norwood was perhaps 30, with the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his life outdoors. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was a quietness about him that suggested he didn't waste words, but when he spoke, he meant what he said. Tell me about your brother, Jake said finally, as they finished their meal. Grace sighed, looking down at Emma sleeping peacefully in the cradle they'd improvised from a drawer. Randall is 5 years older than me. He's always been troubled. Our parents died when I was 16, and he was supposed to look after me. But mostly I looked after him. He drinks, gambles. He's always chasing some scheme to get rich quick. And now he's decided selling your daughter is his ticket to fortune? Grace nodded, her throat tight. He showed up 2 days ago. I hadn't seen him in over a year. He seemed desperate, more than usual. He kept talking about owing money to some dangerous men. She twisted her hands in her lap. At first he just wanted money, but I have so little. Then yesterday he saw a notice in the newspaper about a wealthy Boston couple seeking to adopt a baby girl. That's when he got this idea. Do you know who he's arranged to sell Emma to? No. He just said he'd found someone willing to pay $500. Grace looked up, her eyes filling with tears. I can't lose her, Jake. She's all I have. Jake reached across the small table and briefly covered her hand with his. You won't lose her, I promise. His touch was warm and reassuring, and Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious. You've been very kind, she said, but I can't expect you to protect us forever. You said yourself you're just passing through. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I don't have pressing business elsewhere. I can stay a few days, help you figure something out. Why would you do that for strangers? Jake was quiet for a moment. When I was a boy, my mother died in childbirth. My father couldn't cope. He tried to give my baby sister away to a traveling preacher and his wife. His jaw tightened at the memory. A neighbor woman stepped in, stopped it, raised us both until my father came to his senses. Some debts you can't repay directly, so you pass them forward. Grace studied him, seeing the conviction in his eyes. "What happened to your sister?" A small smile touched his lips. "She's married to a blacksmith in Kansas, has 3 children of her own now." "And your father?" "Passed on 5 years ago. He made his peace with what he almost did, became a good father in the end." Grace nodded slowly. "I'm sorry about your mother." "It was a long time ago." Jake stood and stretched. "We should get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out who your brother's been talking to and put a stop to this." Grace settled onto the bed while Jake arranged himself in the chair, his long legs stretched out before him. Despite the strangeness of the situation, sharing a room with a man she'd only met hours before, Grace felt safer than she had in days. "Jake," she said softly into the darkness. Thank you." There was a pause, then his deep voice replied, "Get some sleep, Grace." As she drifted off, Grace wondered what twist of fate had brought Jake Norwood to that alley at exactly the moment she needed him most. Morning came with weak sunlight filtering through the curtains. Grace awoke to find Jake already up and dressed, a fresh pot of coffee on the table, and Emma gurgling happily in his arms. The sight was so unexpectedly domestic that Grace felt momentarily disoriented. "She was fussing," Jake explained, looking slightly sheepish. "Didn't want to wake you." Grace sat up, smoothing her tousled hair. "You're good with her." Jake shrugged. "Babies are straightforward. They tell you what they need." "Not always," Grace said with a small smile, reaching for Emma. "Sometimes it's a mystery." She took her daughter, noticing that Jake had even managed to change her diaper, albeit somewhat clumsily. "You've done this before?" "Helped with my niece and nephews a time or two." He poured her a cup of coffee. "I thought we might start at the telegraph office. If your brother's been corresponding with someone about Emma, they might know something." Grace nodded, grateful for his practical approach. "I should check in at the shop, too. Mrs. Tanner, my employer, will wonder where I am." After a quick breakfast, they headed out, Grace carrying Emma, while Jake walked slightly ahead, alert for any sign of Randall. The morning air was crisp, the town already busy with merchants opening their stores and wagons delivering goods. The seamstress shop was a small but tidy establishment on a side street. A bell tinkled as they entered, and an older woman looked up from where she was measuring fabric at a counter. "Grace, I was worried when you didn't come in yesterday afternoon." Her eyes darted curiously to Jake. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Tanner. Something came up." Grace hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "My brother's in town. He's causing some trouble. Mr. Norwood has been kind enough to help me." Mrs. Tanner's expression softened with concern. "Your brother? The one you've mentioned before?" When Grace nodded, she continued, "What kind of trouble, dear?" Grace swallowed hard. "He's trying to take Emma, to sell her." Mrs. Tanner's hand flew to her mouth. Good heavens! She looked at Jake with new appreciation. "And you're protecting them, Mr. Norwood?" Jake nodded, his hat in his hands. "Yes, madam." "Well, thank the Lord for that." She came around the counter and took Grace's free hand. "You stay away as long as you need to, dear. Your job will be waiting." "Thank you," Grace said, relieved. "I was hoping to pick up my week's wages if that's all right. We might need to leave town for a while." Mrs. Tanner nodded briskly. "Of course." She went to a small cash box and counted out several coins. "Here's what you've earned, and a little extra." "Don't argue," she added when Grace began to protest. "Think of it as an advance." From the seamstress shop, they made their way to the telegraph office. The operator, a thin man with spectacles, recognized Jake from his arrival in town 2 days before. Mr. Norwood, back already. His eyes flicked to Grace and Emma with interest. Mr. Phillips, Jake nodded. We're looking for information about a man named Randall Collins. He might have sent or received telegrams in the last few days. Phillips frowned. You know I can't discuss private communications, Mr. Norwood. Grace stepped forward. Please, Mr. Phillips, Randall is my brother. He's trying to sell my baby to strangers. We need to know who he's been communicating with. The operator's eyes widened. Sell your baby? He seemed at a loss for words. Criminal, Jake supplied, and we're trying to stop it before it happens. Phillips hesitated, then sighed. I shouldn't do this, but he flipped through a ledger. Yes, there was a Collins sending telegrams, 3 in the last 2 days, all to the same recipient in Denver, a Mr. Howard Fletcher. Jake and Grace exchanged glances. What did the telegrams say? Jake asked. The first asked if the offer still stood. The second confirmed he had the child, a girl, 6 months old, healthy. The third, sent yesterday afternoon, said there was a delay, but he would deliver as promised by tomorrow noon. Denver's reply authorized payment of $500 upon delivery. Grace felt her knees weaken. Tomorrow noon, she whispered. That's when he plans to take her. Jake's jaw set grimly. Not gonna happen. He turned back to Phillips. Do you know anything about this Fletcher? Phillips shook his head. No, sir. First time I've handled communications with him. They thanked him and left, stepping back into the sunlight. Grace's mind was racing. Denver's only a day's journey by train. If Randall planned to deliver Emma by noon tomorrow, he'd have to leave on the morning train, Jake finished her thought, which gives us until then to deal with him. He looked thoughtfully down the street. Or we could leave first. Grace blinked. Leave. Take the afternoon train today. Get you and Emma somewhere safe, far from here. He met her eyes. Randall can't sell what he can't find. But my job, my home, you can find work elsewhere. And that room. Jake hesitated, not wanting to offend her. Grace, you could make a fresh start somewhere new. She couldn't deny the appeal of his suggestion. What was truly holding her to Cottonwood Springs? Painful memories of Charles, a job that barely kept her and Emma fed. And yet, running feels like letting him win, she said finally. And what if he follows? I'd always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if he'd found us. Jake nodded slowly. You're right. Better to end this here. He thought for a moment. We need to find Randall, make sure he understands that his plan isn't happening, and we should wire this Fletcher character, let him know the deal is off. As they discussed options, neither noticed the figure watching them from the shadowy space between 2 buildings. Randall Collins's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he observed his sister and the interfering cowboy. His hand tightened around the neck of a whiskey bottle. That baby was his ticket out of debt, his only chance to pay off the men who'd promised to break more than just his fingers if he didn't settle up by the end of the week. He wasn't about to let some stranger ruin everything. Not when he was so close. Randall slunk back into the shadows. He needed a new plan. Jake and Grace spent the morning making inquiries around town, trying to locate Randall. The saloon owner reported that Randall had been there until closing the night before, but hadn't returned this morning. The hotel clerk hadn't seen him. The livery stable owner mentioned that a man matching Randall's description had been asking about hiring a horse and wagon, but hadn't completed the transaction. By midday, they had stopped at the small restaurant for lunch. Emma was fussing, overtired from the morning's activities, and Grace was bouncing her gently while trying to eat her stew one-handed. "Here," Jake said, reaching for the baby. "Let me hold her while you eat." Grace hesitated only briefly before handing Emma over. Jake cradled her expertly, and to Grace's surprise, Emma settled almost immediately, her big eyes fixing on Jake's face with apparent fascination. "She likes you," Grace said, taking advantage of having both hands free to eat her rapidly cooling stew. Jake smiled down at the baby. "Smart kid," he said, and Grace couldn't help but laugh. It was such a normal moment sharing a meal, caring for the baby together, that Grace could almost forget the circumstances that had brought them together. Almost, but not quite. "If we can't find Randall," she said, returning to their problem, "maybe we should send a telegram to this Fletcher person ourselves. Explain that the baby is not for sale and never was." Jake nodded. "Worth trying. Though men who buy children aren't likely to be concerned with the finer points of morality." After lunch, they returned to the telegraph office. Mr. Phillips raised his eyebrows but took their message to Howard Fletcher in Denver. "Deal with R. Collins invalid. Child not for sale. Authorities being notified. Further attempts will result in criminal charges." "That should give him pause," Jake said as they left the office. "Now we need to find your brother." They continued their search through the afternoon, showing Randall's description to shopkeepers and townspeople. Several had seen him, but no one knew where he was staying. As the day waned, they decided to return to the hotel. "Maybe we should speak to the sheriff," Grace suggested as they walked. "Explain what Randall is planning." Jake looked skeptical. "Sheriff Dawson isn't known for his diligence, and selling children, while morally reprehensible, exists in a legal gray area, especially when it's family involved. So the law won't help us?" "I didn't say that, but going to Dawson might tip our hand to Randall before we're ready. Let's keep that as a last resort." As they approached the hotel, a shout from across the street caught their attention. "Hey, Norwood!" They turned to see the livery owner waving them over. Jake placed a protective hand on Grace's back as they crossed to him. "That fella you were asking about," the man said. "He was back an hour ago, rented my best horse. Said he'd be back by morning." Jake and Grace exchanged concerned looks. "Did he say where he was going?" Jake asked. "Nope, but he headed out east." The livery owner scratched his chin. "Seemed in an awful hurry." "Thank you," Jake said, pressing a coin into the man's hand. As they continued to the hotel, Grace clutched Emma tighter. "Where do you think he's gone?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but east is toward Denver. Maybe he's meeting this Fletcher character somewhere in between." Grace's steps faltered. "If he can't deliver Emma to Denver by noon tomorrow, maybe he's arranged for this Fletcher to come to him." Her voice quavered. "They could be planning to take her tonight." Jake's expression darkened. "We won't let that happen." He guided her into the hotel lobby. "Let's get you and Emma settled in the room. I'll arrange for some supper to be brought up. Then I'm going to have another look around town, see if I can find out anything more." In the room, Grace tried to keep herself busy while Jake was gone. She fed and changed Emma, tidied their few possessions, and paced by the window, watching the street below as shadows lengthened across the dirt road. Her mind kept spinning with horrible scenarios, Randall and some faceless stranger breaking in, taking Emma while she slept, spiriting her away on a train before Grace even realized she was gone. When a knock came at the door, she jumped. "Who is it?" "It's me," Jake's voice answered. She hurried to let him in, relief washing over her. He carried a tray of food and a grim expression. "What's wrong?" she asked as he set the tray down. "Did you find out something?" Jake nodded. "The afternoon train from Denver arrived an hour ago. According to the station master, a well-dressed man got off, asked for directions to the hotel." He met her eyes. "It could be Fletcher." Grace sank into a chair, her hand at her throat. "He's here? In town?" "Maybe. I didn't see anyone matching that description at the hotel, but I wasn't exactly being subtle asking questions yesterday. He could be staying elsewhere." "And Randall?" "No sign of him. But if he rode east, he could have been going to meet the train." Grace looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in the drawer cradle. "What do we do?" Jake pulled his chair closer to hers. "We stay alert. I don't think they'll try anything tonight too risky with me here. But tomorrow, when the morning train leaves for Denver..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They ate in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts. After clearing away the meal, Jake checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded and in good working order. "I'll stay awake tonight," he said. "You get some sleep." Grace shook her head. "I couldn't possibly sleep now." Jake studied her tired face. "You need rest, Grace, for Emma's sake, if not your own. I'll wake you if anything happens." Reluctantly, Grace lay down on the bed, Emma beside her. Despite her certainty that sleep would elude her, the exhaustion of the day soon pulled her under. She woke with a start some hours later. The room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight through a gap in the curtains. Jake sat in the chair by the window, his silhouette still and vigilant. "Jake," she whispered. He turned. "Everything's quiet. Go back to sleep." Instead, Grace sat up carefully, not disturbing Emma. She moved to the window, standing beside his chair. "You should rest too," she said softly. Jake shook his head. "I'm fine." Grace studied his profile in the dim light. "Why are you doing all this, Jake?" "Really?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "I told you about my sister." "Yes, but this is different. You don't know us." Jake turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the moonlight. "When I saw you in that alley, with your brother threatening to take your child, something in me just couldn't walk away. Some things are just plain wrong." He paused. "And then I got to know you, got to know Emma. You're good people, Grace. You deserve better than what life's handed you so far." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to." His voice was gruff with emotion. Without thinking, Grace reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Jake covered it with his own, the touch sending a current between them. For a long moment they remained that way, connected in the quiet darkness. Then Emma stirred and made a small sound, breaking the spell. Grace withdrew her hand reluctantly. "I should check on her," she murmured, moving back to the bed. Jake watched her go, his expression unreadable in the shadows. Morning arrived with no disturbances. Jake had dozed in the chair for a few hours while Grace took watch, but now both were awake, tense with anticipation of what the day might bring. The morning train to Denver would leave at 10 o'clock, just 3 hours away. "I'm going to go down. Have a look around," Jake said, buckling on his gun belt. "See if there's any sign of Randall or this Fletcher character. You stay here with the door locked. Don't open it for anyone but me." Grace nodded, Emma in her arms. "Be careful." Jake paused at the door, looking back at them. For a moment, he seemed about to say something more, but then simply nodded and left. Alone with Emma, Grace tried to keep her fears at bay. She fed and dressed her daughter, packed their few belongings in case they needed to leave quickly, and waited. The minutes crawled by like hours. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. "Grace, it's me!" She hurried to the door, recognizing Jake's voice. But when she opened it, her blood ran cold. Jake stood there, but behind him was Randall, pressing a gun into Jake's back. "Morning, Gracie," Randall said with a nasty smile. "Invite us in, why don't you?" Grace backed away as they entered, Jake's face tight with anger and frustration. "I'm sorry," Jake said. "He got the drop on me." Randall prodded Jake further into the room, then kicked the door shut behind them. "Found your cowboy friend asking questions about me at the saloon. Figured I'd better have a word with him." His bloodshot eyes focused on Emma. "There's my little gold mine, ready for her big journey." "Randall, please," Grace begged. "She's your niece, your own blood." "Blood don't pay debts, Gracie." Randall's face hardened. "I owe some very dangerous men a lot of money. They've already broken 2 of my fingers as a warning." He wiggled his splinted hand. "Next time it'll be my neck." "There are other ways," Jake said carefully. "Ways that don't involve selling an innocent child." Randall laughed harshly. "Like what? You gonna give me $500, cowboy?" When Jake didn't answer, he sneered. "Didn't think so." "Who is this Fletcher?" Grace asked, trying to keep him talking. "How do you know he'll treat Emma well?" "He's some rich fellow from back east. Him and his wife can't have kids. They're staying at the Oakwood Inn on the edge of town." Randall shrugged. "They'll give her a good life. Better than you can, that's for sure." "A good life built on a lie," Jake said. "What happens when she grows up and learns she was bought like cattle? That her uncle sold her for drinking money?" Randall's face flushed with anger. "It ain't like that. I'm doing her a favor. She'll have opportunities, education." "She has a mother who loves her," Jake countered. "Nothing's worth more than that." Something flickered in Randall's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. "Too late for second thoughts now. Fletcher's waiting, and I need that money." He gestured with the gun. "Put the baby in her blanket, Gracie. We're going for a little walk to the Oakwood Inn." Grace clutched Emma tighter. "No." Randall's expression darkened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." "You'll have to go through me first," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. Randall sneered. "You ain't exactly in a position to make threats, cowboy." What happened next unfolded in seconds. Jake lunged forward, knocking Randall's gun hand upward just as Randall squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Grace screamed, covering Emma with her body as the 2 men grappled. Randall was younger but smaller, and Jake's strength and experience quickly gave him the advantage. He slammed Randall against the wall, knocking the wind from him, then delivered a powerful blow to his jaw. Randall crumpled to the floor, the gun skittering away across the wooden boards. Jake retrieved the weapon, pointing it at Randall as the other man groaned and tried to sit up. "Grace, are you and Emma all right?" Jake asked, not taking his eyes off Randall. "We're fine," Grace said, her voice shaking. Emma was crying now, frightened by the noise and commotion. There was a pounding at the door. "What's going on in there?" called the hotel manager's voice. "Everything's under control," Jake called back. "But you might want to fetch the sheriff." When Sheriff Dawson arrived 10 minutes later, Jake explained the situation while keeping Randall covered with the gun. The sheriff, a portly man with a graying mustache, listened with increasing disbelief. "Selling a baby?" he repeated, glaring at Randall. "That's about the lowest thing I ever heard." It's a legitimate adoption, Randall protested, holding a handkerchief to his bleeding lip. The Fletchers are respectable people. They're going to pay a fair price. That's trafficking, not adoption, the sheriff cut him off. And it's against the law in this territory. He turned to Jake. You say these Fletcher folks are staying at the Oakwood Inn? Jake nodded. According to him. I'll pay them a visit, explain the situation. Dawson hauled Randall to his feet. Meanwhile, you're coming with me, Collins. Attempted kidnapping, assault. That ought to keep you locked up for a good while. As the sheriff led Randall away in handcuffs, Randall looked back at Grace. For the first time, she saw something like regret in his eyes. I'm sorry, Gracie, he said quietly. I didn't see another way out. Grace couldn't bring herself to respond. She stood with Emma in her arms, watching as her only living relative was led away to jail. When they were alone again, Jake gently touched her shoulder. Are you sure you're all right? Grace nodded, still shaken. Thanks to you. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more. You could have been killed. Jake's mouth quirked in a half smile. Takes more than the likes of Randall Collins to do me in. His expression grew serious. It's over now. Emma's safe. Grace realized he was right. The immediate danger had passed. Randall would be in jail, and the sheriff would deal with the Fletchers. Emma was safe. And yet, a new worry had taken root in her heart. With the crisis resolved, would Jake Norwood move on? The thought of him leaving created an unexpected ache in her chest. As if reading her thoughts, Jake said, I suppose I should be moving along soon, now that you and Emma are out of danger. Grace swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. Where will you go? He shrugged. Not sure. North, maybe. Wyoming Territory's got work for a man who doesn't mind the cold. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Grace said, We'll miss you, Emma especially. She's become quite attached. Jake's eyes held hers. Just Emma? Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. I've grown fond of your company as well. Jake took a step closer. Fond enough to consider another option? Her heart quickened. What option? You could come with me. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. You and Emma make a fresh start somewhere new, together. Grace stared at him, stunned by the suggestion. Jake, we barely know each other. I know enough, he said simply. I know you're strong and brave and devoted to your daughter. I know I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe I'm a fool for asking. But these past 2 days, with you and Emma, it felt right, Grace. It felt like family. Grace's mind whirled with the implications of what he was suggesting. Leave Cottonwood Springs? Travel with a man she'd known for just 2 days? It was impulsive, reckless even. And yet, hadn't she seen the true measure of Jake Norwood in those 2 days? Hadn't he shown his character in every action, every decision? There was goodness in him, a solid dependability that reminded her of the mountains themselves. It's crazy, she whispered. Maybe, he agreed. Or maybe it's the sanest thing either of us has done in a long time. Emma chose that moment to reach out her small hand toward Jake, gurgling happily. Both adults looked at the baby, then at each other. And something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. I'm not asking for promises, Jake said softly. Just a chance to see where this road might lead. Grace took a deep breath. Wyoming is very cold, I hear. A slow smile spread across Jake's face. I'll keep you warm. Sheriff Dawson returned later that afternoon to report that Howard Fletcher and his wife had left town on the morning train, denying any knowledge of a plan to purchase a baby. Without proof beyond Randall's word, there wasn't much the sheriff could do to pursue them. As for your brother, he told Grace, he'll be facing charges here, probably looking at a year or two in territorial prison. Grace nodded, feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Thank you, Sheriff. After Dawson left, Jake turned to Grace. So, what have you decided? Grace looked around the small hotel room, thinking of her cramped quarters above the seamstress shop. The struggle of each day just to keep herself and Emma fed and clothed. Then she looked at Jake, this good, steady man who had risked his life for them, who was offering them a new beginning. Yes, she said simply, we'll come with you. The smile that lit Jake's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, cupping her face in his large, calloused hands. May I? He asked, his eyes searching hers. Grace nodded, and Jake lowered his lips to hers in a gentle kiss that promised comfort, protection, and perhaps, in time, love. 2 days later, they boarded the northbound train. Grace carried Emma, and Jake carried their bags, her carpet sack and his weathered saddlebags. His horse had been sold, the money added to their modest savings to give them a start in their new life. As the train pulled away from Cottonwood Springs, Grace felt a curious lightness. She was leaving behind the place where she had known both joy and profound sorrow, the town where her husband was buried. And yet, she wasn't leaving him, not really. Charles would always be in her heart, in her memories, and in the daughter who had his smile. She looked at Jake, who was entertaining Emma with funny faces, making the baby giggle delightedly. This unexpected man, this cowboy who had stepped between her family and disaster, was offering them a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Having second thoughts? Jake asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Grace shook her head. No, just thinking how strange life is, how one moment can change everything. Jake nodded. The moment I saw you in that alley, I knew my life was about to take a turn. For the better, I hope, Grace said, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Jake reached across and took her hand, his grip warm and sure. The best turn it's ever taken. They traveled north for 2 days, the landscape changing gradually from the dry foothills of Colorado to the rugged beauty of Wyoming Territory. Jake explained that he had a friend who owned a small ranch near a town called Pine Ridge, who might have work for him. It's not much of a place yet, he told her as they watched the scenery pass, but it's growing. They've got a school, a church, good people. It sounds perfect, Grace said, meaning it. After the events in Cottonwood Springs, a quiet town sounded like paradise. When they finally arrived at Pine Ridge, it was indeed small, a single main street with basic businesses, surrounded by scattered homesteads and ranches. But the air was clean and crisp, the mountains majestic in the distance, and the people who nodded greetings seemed friendly enough. Jake's friend, Tom Harker, met them at the small train platform. He was a big, bearded man with a booming laugh who clapped Jake on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. Norwood. When I got your telegram, I could hardly believe it. You, settling down? His eyes twinkled as he looked at Grace and Emma, though I can certainly see why. Jake made the introductions, and Tom immediately insisted they stay at his ranch until they found a place of their own. The missus would have my hide if I didn't bring you home. She's been cooking since your telegram arrived. Tom's ranch was modest but well kept, with a comfortable house, a solid barn, and good grazing land stretching toward the mountains. His wife, Martha, was as warm as her husband, immediately taking to Grace and cooing over Emma. "It's so wonderful to have another woman around," she confided as she showed Grace to a guest room. "The nearest neighbor's wife is 10 miles away, and we see each other maybe once a month." Over a hearty dinner that night, Tom offered Jake a job helping with the ranch and a small cabin on the property that had belonged to a former worker. "It needs some fixing up," he admitted. "Been empty for a couple years, but it's sturdy, and with some work, it could be real comfortable." Jake looked at Grace. "What do you think?" Grace smiled. "I think it sounds like a home." The next day, Jake took Grace to see the cabin. It was indeed in need of work. The roof leaked in one corner. The windows needed new glass and the stove was rusty from disuse. But it had good bones, as Martha put it, and Jake was already listing the improvements he would make. "I can fix the roof tomorrow, replace that window by the end of the week. The stove we might need to replace entirely, but Tom says there's one in town we can get for a fair price." He looked at her anxiously. "It's not much, I know." Grace took in the small, dusty space, already imagining it clean and warm, with curtains on the windows and a rug on the floor. It was twice the size of her room above the seamstress shop, with a separate bedroom and a kitchen area. Outside, a small porch faced the mountains, and a stream ran nearby. "It's perfect," she said softly. Jake's eyes lit up. "Really?" Grace nodded, bouncing Emma on her hip. "Really, it just needs some care. That's all." She hesitated, then added, "Like us." Jake moved to her side, slipping an arm around her waist. "I aim to provide that care, Grace, for the cabin and for you both." He looked down at Emma, who reached up to grab his chin. "I know I can't replace Charles. I wouldn't try. But I hope in time Emma might come to think of me as a father." Grace leaned into his strength, allowing herself to believe in this new beginning. "I think she already does." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jake worked from dawn to dusk, splitting his time between helping Tom with the ranch and fixing up the cabin. Grace assisted Martha with household duties and began putting her sewing skills to use, taking in mending from neighboring ranches. By the time the first snow dusted the mountains, the cabin was transformed. The roof was solid, the windows tight against the wind, and a new stove provided warmth and a cooking surface. Grace had sewn curtains from fabric Martha gave her, and a rag rug brightened the plank floor. Jake had built a sturdy cradle for Emma and a rocking chair for Grace. It was a home, humble but filled with growing affection. They had agreed to take things slowly, to allow their feelings to develop naturally. Jake was a gentleman, insisting on sleeping in the main room while Grace and Emma took the bedroom. But as the autumn deepened toward winter, the boundaries between them softened. It was an evening in early November when everything changed. Emma had been asleep for hours, and Grace and Jake sat before the fire, talking quietly about their day. There was an easy companionship between them now, a comfort in each other's presence that felt as natural as breathing. Grace was mending one of Jake's shirts, and he was whittling a small wooden horse, a toy for Emma, though she was still too young to appreciate it. The domesticity of the scene struck Grace suddenly, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. Jake noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Nothing's wrong. That's just it." I never thought I'd feel this way again, after Charles. Safe. Happy. She set aside her sewing. You've given us so much, Jake. Jake put down his carving knife and moved to kneel before her chair. You and Emma have given me more. A purpose. A home. He took her hands in his. A family, if you'll have me. Grace's breath caught. Jake, I love you, Grace, he said simply. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you in that alley, defending your child with everything you had. And every day since has only made me more certain. He squeezed her hands gently. I know it hasn't been long. I know Charles will always have a place in your heart. But if you could find room for me too. Grace freed one hand to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. There's already room, Jake. More than room. She took a shaky breath. I love you too. The joy that transformed his features was like nothing Grace had ever seen. Jake rose up on his knees and pulled her into a tender kiss that quickly deepened, expressing all the feelings that had been building between them over the weeks. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, Grace. Let me be a father to Emma, a husband to you. Let me spend my life making you both happy. Grace's answer was another kiss, this one filled with promise and certainty. Yes. They were married 2 weeks later in Pine Ridge's small church. Martha had helped Grace alter an old dress of hers into a simple but elegant wedding gown, and Tom stood as Jake's best man. Emma, now 8 months old and trying to crawl, was held by Martha throughout the ceremony, occasionally babbling as if offering her own blessing on the proceedings. The preacher's words were simple but powerful, speaking of new beginnings and second chances at happiness. When Jake slipped a thin gold band onto Grace's finger, bought with money he'd been saving for their future, and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. The small reception afterward at the Harkers' ranch was joyful, with neighbors from miles around coming to welcome the new family to the community. Grace was overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance, so different from the polite distance she'd experienced in Cottonwood Springs. As night fell and the last guests departed, Jake lifted Emma from where she had fallen asleep in an improvised bed of blankets. "Let's go home, Mrs. Norwood," he said softly. Mrs. Norwood. The name felt right, a perfect fit for this new chapter of her life. Grace slipped her arm through his, and they walked together through the starlit night to their cabin, their home. Later, with Emma peacefully asleep in her cradle and the fire casting a golden glow throughout the cabin, Jake and Grace lay entwined in what was now their bed. The intimacy they shared was both passionate and tender, a physical expression of the love that had grown between them. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Grace whispered, her head resting on Jake's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Jake's hand stroked her hair. "When my sister was born, my father couldn't see past his grief to the gift he'd been given. I promised myself I'd never be that blind." He kissed the top of her head. "Meeting you and Emma, loving you both. It's the greatest gift I could have imagined." Grace raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "You saved us, Jake. Not just from Randall, but from a life of just getting by. You gave us hope again." Jake touched her face gently. "And you saved me from a lonely life on the trail, always moving, never belonging. We saved each other, Grace." As winter settled over Pine Ridge, the little family fell into comfortable routines. Jake worked alongside Tom, learning the ranching business with an eye toward someday having a spread of his own. Grace's sewing skills became in demand throughout the area, providing a steady income that complemented Jake's earnings. Emma thrived, growing stronger and more curious every day. In December, a letter arrived from Mrs. Tanner in Cottonwood Springs, forwarded by the postmaster. It contained news of Randall. He had been sentenced to 18 months in prison for his crimes and warm wishes for their happiness. Grace wrote back, sharing her news and inviting her former employer to visit in the spring if she wished. Christmas was simple but joyful. Jake had crafted a small rocking horse for Emma, and Grace had secretly made him a new shirt and a leather wallet. Their greatest gift, they agreed, was simply being together, safe and warm while snow piled high outside their windows. As they sat before the fire that Christmas night, Emma asleep in Jake's arms, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since before Charles's death. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. "The journey that brought us here," she replied. "If Randall hadn't come to Cottonwood Springs that day, if you hadn't been walking down that particular alley at that exact moment." "Providence," Jake said simply. "Some things are meant to be." Grace nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "I believe that now." Jake shifted Emma gently to one arm and used his free hand to tilt Grace's face toward his. "I have something to tell you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Tom offered me a partnership in the ranch today." Grace's eyes widened. "A partnership? Jake, that's wonderful." "It means more work, more responsibility," he cautioned, "but also a real stake in something, a future to build on." He searched her face. "What do you think?" "I think," Grace said slowly, "that Emma and I are very lucky to have a husband and father who works so hard for our future." She kissed him softly. "I'm proud of you, Jake Norwood." His face lit up with pleasure. "There's more. Tom mentioned that the property adjoining his to the east might come up for sale in the spring. If we save carefully, with my share of the ranch profits and your sewing money." He let the implication hang in the air. "Our own place," Grace breathed, hardly daring to hope. Jake nodded. "Our own land. Nothing fancy at first, but something to build on, something to pass down to Emma and—" He hesitated, then continued softly, "and maybe other children, someday." The thought of expanding their family, of giving Emma brothers or sisters, filled Grace with a sweet longing. "I'd like that," she whispered, "very much." The winter passed, and with spring came new beginnings. Emma took her first wobbly steps on the cabin's porch, falling into Jake's waiting arms with a squeal of delight. Grace's sewing business flourished, with orders coming from as far away as the county seat. And true to Tom's prediction, the neighboring property became available. It was smaller than Tom's ranch, with fewer acres of good grazing land, but it had a year-round stream, a stand of timber, and a view of the mountains that took the breath away. The cabin on the property was larger than their current home, though in need of repairs, similar to those Jake had already proven himself capable of making. When the sale was finalized in late May, Jake lifted Grace and spun her around right there in the land office, both of them laughing like children while the land agent looked on with an indulgent smile. "Norwood Ranch," Jake said as they walked the boundaries of their new property that evening, Emma toddling between them, holding their hands. "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" "It's perfect," Grace agreed, her heart full as she watched the setting sun paint their land in hues of gold and amber. That night, after Emma was asleep in her cradle, Grace and Jake lay in their bed, making plans for their future. They would move to the new cabin before winter, expand the herd gradually, perhaps add chickens and a milk cow. Grace would continue her sewing, and they would save for improvements to the property. It won't be easy, Jake acknowledged. Ranching never is. There will be hard years, droughts, harsh winters. We'll face them together, Grace said, nestling against him. The three of us. Jake's hand moved to rest gently on her stomach. Maybe more than three someday. Grace smiled in the darkness. Someday soon, I think. Jake raised himself on one elbow, looking down at her with dawning understanding. Grace? Are you saying? She nodded, her eyes shining with happiness. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before I told you. Jake's face transformed with wonder. A baby? We're having a baby. In about 7 months, Grace confirmed. Emma will have a little brother or sister just after Christmas. Jake gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. I love you, he whispered fiercely. Both of you. All of you. As Grace drifted to sleep in the circle of her husband's arms, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate young widow in a dusty Colorado town to the beloved wife of a Wyoming rancher, expectant mother, with a future full of promise stretching before her. All because her brother had tried to sell her child, and a cowboy had said, "Not while I'm breathing." On a crisp December morning, just after the first significant snowfall of the season, Grace gave birth to a son. Jake paced anxiously outside the bedroom door while the midwife and Martha attended to Grace. Emma, now nearly 18 months old and talking in simple sentences, watched her father's agitation with wide eyes from Tom's lap. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, Jake stopped mid-stride, his face a mixture of relief and joy. Moments later, Martha opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Jake," she announced, "a fine, strong boy. And Grace is doing well." Jake swept Emma into his arms and carried her into the bedroom, where Grace lay propped against pillows, a small bundle cradled against her breast. Her face was tired but radiant as she looked up at them. "Come meet your brother," she said softly to Emma. Jake set the toddler carefully on the bed beside Grace, then leaned down to kiss his wife's forehead. "You're amazing," he whispered. Grace smiled up at him. "Would you like to hold your son?" Jake nodded, his throat tight with emotion as Grace placed the tiny infant in his arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he briefly opened his eyes, Jake caught a glimpse of deep blue. "He's perfect," Jake said, his voice rough with feeling. "Just like his mother." Emma patted her new brother's blanket. "Baby," she said solemnly. Grace laughed softly. "That's right, sweetheart, your baby brother." Jake sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling his son while keeping an arm around Emma, his family, complete, whole. "What shall we name him?" Grace asked, though they had discussed possibilities during the long autumn evenings. Jake looked down at his son's face. "Charles," he said quietly. "Charles Thomas Norwood. If that's all right with you." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "It's perfect. Charles for Emma's father, Thomas for the friend who helped give us our start here." She reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Welcome to the world, Charles Thomas Norwood. You are very loved." As a new day dawned on the Norwood Ranch, the small family gathered together in the warmth of their home, bound by love that had grown from the most unexpected beginnings. Outside, snow blanketed their land, pristine and full of possibility, much like the future that stretched before them, a future they would build together, one day at a time.